Thomas A. Edison's development of the motion picture in 1889 led to this, the first movie studio in 1893. Called the Black Maria, it cost $637.67 and was built next to Edison's laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey. It was nothing more than a tar paper shack built on a turntable so that it could keep its skylight turned to the sun. Early Nickelodeons featured this coy offering by Edison, the screen's first kiss, with John C. Rice and Mae Irwin. Progress was rapid. At first, the novelty of a picture that moved was enough in itself, but soon the public wanted stories. Edison's The Great Train Robbery, filmed along the Lackawanna Railroad near Paterson, New Jersey in 1903, was the screen's first real narrative film. Edwin S. Porter directed for Edison, and his effort has become a classic. Here, for the first time, a continuity of many scenes shot in varying locations and spliced together pointed the way to what movies would one day become. Some of the early film companies had their studios on rooftops in Manhattan, open-air sets on circular tracks to follow the sun. But as dramatic scope widened, their need for rural exterior settings brought them across the Hudson to New Jersey. The Fort Lee Ferry from 125th Street became a regular run for them, especially after Sidney Olcott of the Calum Company discovered in 1907 that the woods and hilly roads of the Palisades near Fort Lee and Coitesville could provide a convenient Wild West setting. The first American center for the motion picture industry was to develop here atop the Palisades at Fort Lee, New Jersey. Rambo's Hotel in Coitesville was used as a place to dress and appeared often in film as the exterior of a Western saloon. The Westerns filmed here on Hammett's Hill were the very first produced in America, and on that long-forgotten day in the hills of North Jersey became the staple product of the American film industry. Robert Vignola, before he became a director, rode in many a cowboy thriller at Fort Lee for the Calum organization. And economics made of Alice Joyce one of the first Western heroines. "Can you ride?" the director asked. "It's worth $10 a day if you can." "I couldn't do it if Mother didn't need the money," said Miss Joyce. And so a star was born. Names which retain their fame today first came to light at Fort Lee. Rescued from an eagle's nest is an example. Edison's director, E.S. Porter, was badgered by a gangling youth from Louisville who wanted the part of the heroic woodsman. "You're not husky enough," said Porter. "I'll pad up for the part," the actor insisted. In the end, he got the job. His name was D.W. Griffith. The part of the eagle was played by a stuffed bird from a taxidermist shop, hinged wings flapping to the tugging of invisible black threads. The actor had to depict his reactions with facial expression and gesture. Griffith and his co-workers made sure no one would miss the point. This was the first real cliffhanger thriller, and it showed some of the filmic advances that were being made, as exteriors shot on the Palisades at Fort Lee were spliced together with scenes shot in the man-made surroundings of the studio. As he always did, Griffith put everything he had into his job and won applause as the undefeatable woodsman. Here on the rocky bluffs at Fort Lee, the career of D.W. Griffith had begun. And just ahead was his first directorial effort, Adventures of Dolly. By the next year, Griffith teamed with another whose name holds lasting luster, Mack Sennett. Griffith and Sennett together, a combination with the inventive genius and the astonishing vigor of action to take a simple thing like a broken curtain pole and build it into a three-ring riot before 10 minutes have passed. This film, shot on location in Fort Lee, returns to the screen now for the first time in more than half a century. The negative was lost in 1910, and only in 1963 was a print found in the Library of Congress. In this first slapstick comedy, the pattern of the comic chase, which Mack Sennett was to immortalize, came into being, along with visual gags which are still used today. Where it started, the cumulative chase, which builds and builds, a basic premise on which Sennett would later work wonderful variations with his Keystone Cops. behind curtained windows, residents of Fort Lee, those who weren't in the street, working their heads off as extras for $1 a day, must have wondered what madness had taken their quiet, semi-rural community. D.W. Griffith's wife, Linda Arvidsson, was knocked cold in this scene when she was hit by Sennett's curtain pole while tending a vegetable stand. The difficult thing about a Mack Sennett chase is that to hold interest, it has to keep topping itself. Sennett himself, pole in hand, made sure that this one did. Here is something that looks like a D.W. Griffith touch. The element of suspense as the yowling mob nearly catches the well-meaning object of its anger. And here, for the first time, the purely technical end of motion pictures has turned to comic advantage. Audiences of today are well acquainted with how reverse printing can make the action seem to go backward. But from audiences of 1908, this brought gasps of amazement. Griffith shot this backup scene on the corner of Jane Street and Anderson Avenue, looking north toward Main Street and the Holy Angels Academy. In this kind of film, when the chase is over, the story is over. Griffith and Sennett both knew this, and the classic curtain pole is brought to a swift close with what would later be known in the giant film industry, only now being born, as the surprise ending, the snapper, the old twisteroo. Meantime, in Fort Lee, the beginnings of that film industry of the future were taking strong root. In 1909, the first local studio was built near the Coatesville-Fort Lee line. It was called the Champion Studio, and it still stands today as a printing plant. In April of 1912, Champion made its most elaborate film, Camille, with Irving Cummings, Gertrude Shipman, and Arthur Evers. King Bagot made Ivanhoe as the champion in 1912. Violet Messereau starred for Universal at the champion until 1920. This house on 5th Street in Coitesville was used in many of Champion's westerns. And the Maurice Barrymore home was located near the Champion studio. John Barrymore lived here as a boy. The Lonely Villa was one of D.W. Griffith's most important early pictures. Filmed in Fort Lee, it was based on an idea by Mack Sennett, who in turn was inspired by a newspaper account of a robbery in an isolated country home. The oldest daughter is Mary Pickford. Mack Sennett, in addition to supplying the story idea, played the bit part of the romantic butler. Griffith gets his plot moving at once. Having shown the servants leaving, he brings on his disguised robber with a fake note requiring the presence of Papa in New York. Taking no chances, Papa gets out the family artillery to leave with Mama until he gets back. Here's typical Griffith melodrama. No one but the horrified audience sees the robber unload the pistol. And from this moment, Griffith starts to build his suspense. When this film was made, just such isolation as the story called for was available in the area which today marks the approaches to the George Washington Bridge. Baby sister hears a noise. This was Mary Pickford's first appearance on the screen. She felt it was quite a come down from the Broadway stage, but her contract was a good one. It guaranteed her $25 a week. In all scenes shot in the studio, as these interiors were, you will find the trademark of the studio clearly displayed somewhere on the set. This was to discourage film pirates who would steal unprotected film and use it in their own productions. Meanwhile, Papa is on his way, unaware that an anxious audience knows something that he doesn't. Just when the audience can no longer stand it, Papa decides to call home and make sure everything is all right. Griffith is building toward the peak of his suspense now. Here is Papa, miles from home, car disabled, and just informed that his family is under attack. This scene was shot just south of where the George Washington Bridge is now. That dip in the road is now an overpass of the bridge. And where the old village inn stood then, a large apartment house stands now. In this film, Griffith tried something brand new, and it has been used in motion pictures ever since. It's called in the industry the switchback, or the crosscut, or cutback. By cutting back and forth from action in one location to action in another, Griffith kept track of both elements of his story, giving it added suspense and pace. Here's a movie melodrama must. The rescuers racing against time. Here on the Palisades, the idea was invented. Will help come too late? Griffith could sense the psychological moment when audience suspense had reached its peak. And that was the moment when rescue came. The clothes are different, but we still see the same thing in many a film today. It's still an effective device, and it's still called in the trade the Griffith last-minute rescue. The Eclair studio was built in 1911 by the Eclair Company of France. Many famous directors got their start with Eclair. These scenes of the ruins of the Eclair were filmed in 1935. At Eclair, Robin Hood was produced in 1912, starring Robert Fraser, Guy Oliver, and Barbara Tennant. And in 1920, one of the last films produced at the Eclair was a Fox film starring Pearl White, entitled The White Moth. Meantime, these years from 1914 to 1919 marked the height of Fort Lee's prosperity as a film center, and the huge World Peerless Studio was a major landmark. Here, Lillian Russell made a film of her stage success, Wildfire, with Lionel Barrymore as her leading man. Nita Naldi was a student at the Holy Angels Academy, which was across the street from the World Peerless studio. Legend has it that one afternoon she was looking over the wall at a production in the studio's back lot and was offered a bit part, and so began her movie career. Many other names won fame on the Fort Lee production stages as well. Madge Evans, a child star for World Pictures, and Henry Hull starred in The Volunteer. And world's top star Clara Kimball Young appeared with Jack Holt in a drama called The Road Through the Dark. In this period, when the industry was cranking out some 700 films a year, there were often 6 different features in production at once on the big world peerless stages. Films like Home Wanted with Little Madge Evans, and Hearts Afire with Clara Kimball Young. And The Divine Sacrifice with Kitty Gordon. Vengeance, starring Montague Love. Stolen Hours starred Ethel Clayton. And in His Royal Highness, there were Carlisle Blackwell and Evelyn Greeley. Zena Keefe took the title role in Amateur Widow. And Holbrook Blinn teamed with Alice Brady in The Boss, a film version of Blinn's stage success. Matinee idol Milton Sills starred with Alice Brady in The Rack. And Robert Warwick was featured in The Stolen Voice, just before entering the Army as a captain in World War I. He also starred in Alias Jimmy Valentine. Another major Fort Lee studio was the Willett, just off Main Street. Both Triangle and Fox used the Willett's big double production stages, which got plenty of sun through the greenhouse-like walls and roof. Seated over there is the Willett's big star, a gal named Theodosia Goodman from Cincinnati, better known as Theda Bara. As she became the original vamp, the heartthrob of millions, press agents snubbed Cincinnati and claimed she came from Arabia. Harry Hilliard won stardom in The Envy of a Million Men as the leading man in many of Theda's vamp films. Doug Fairbanks starred at the Willett for the Triangle Company. Here, Doug takes direction from Joe Henneberry during a Western shot in Fort Lee on the spot where the toll gate to the George Washington Bridge now stands. The Fort Lee operation rapidly became truly big business. This great outdoor set was built for Fox's 1916 production of Les Miserables. It covered more than 60 acres in the Palisades section of Fort Lee. Many thousands of extras were used, and on mob scene days, schools and businesses in Fort Lee closed down so that everybody could get into the act. This set was one of the largest ever built and was used for many years in a number of productions. The scope of the movies had broadened considerably since the days of Edison's Black Maria. Using these same sets in Fort Lee, Fox shot A Tale of Two Cities in 1917. For accuracy and detail, these sets would be difficult to surpass even today. Tale of Two Cities starred Bill Farnham and was directed by Frank Lloyd. Many Fort Lee residents worked as extras along with the special character faces from the Broadway stage. During this time, a major Fort Lee fringe industry was the operation of large livery stables to supply horses to the studios for westerns and for scenes such as these from Tale of Two Cities. For the interiors of this early Fox epic, the big sunlit stages of the Willett saw heavy use. June Caprice was a popular Fox star of the period. George Walsh, a Fordham football star, was a featured Fox player. Virginia Pearson lived in a house on Cumbermead Road in the Palisades section of Fort Lee. Mabel Normand and Fatty Arbuckle starred in several of the Fatty and Mabel comedies at the Willett in 1916. The Solax studio was built by Herbert Blanchet near the present entrance to the George Washington Bridge in 1913, and a few of the original buildings are still standing. Here, Warner Oland and Olga Petrova starred in films released by Metro, which would one day become MGM. Young Ethel Barrymore was featured in Metro's Kiss of Hate in 1916. And Metro star Allen Azimova rose to fame at the Solax. This film, The Brat, was her big hit of 1919. Down in a hollow on John Street, the Paragon studio was erected in 1915. At the time, it was the largest and most modern studio in the world. Its 200-foot-long stage was also covered with glass for maximum use of sunlight. And when sunlight failed, or at night, they worked under banks of Cooper Hewitt mercury lamps. Ultimately, the Paragon became the main studio of Paramount Artcraft. It was in the Paragon in 1917 that Mary Pickford made The Poor Little Rich Girl. It was such a success that this single film put Paramount Artcraft on a sound financial footing. Here, too, as many as 6 production crews could work side by side. Billy Burke and Thomas Mahan were featured in films produced at the Paragon by Artcraft. And Gloria Swanson, a Mack Sennett bathing beauty, received her first starring role in this Fort Lee studio. Norma and Constance Talmadge gained fame and fortune in films produced at the Paragon. The largest interior sets of that period were built on the Paragon stages, and crews worked day and night to keep up with public demand. Paramount Artcraft imported Lina Cavalieri, the famous opera star, for its massive production of The Eternal Temptress in 1917. And a director whose gifts and importance are often overlooked, Maurice Tourneur, made his version of Prunella with Marguerite Clark here at the Paragon. His unusual lighting effects and stylized impressionistic settings were original and would influence future productions in many ways. One of the most beautiful of all the Paramount Artcraft stars was Elsie Ferguson. She made Barbary Sheep, The Rise of Jenny Cushing, and other major films in Fort Lee under the direction of Turner. Here is the production crew of The Headless Horseman, made in 1922. Third from the right in the last row is its star, Will Rogers. Among the last films to be made at the Paragon was The Pinch Hitter with Constance Bennett and Glenn Hunter. This was 1925, and production in Fort Lee was only a fraction of its earlier volume. The Paragon buildings remained standing until destroyed by fire in the 1950s. The Lincoln studio was built on the outskirts of Fort Lee on Bergen Boulevard and still stands ready for use today. Its wealthy builder and owner was also one of its stars, E.K. Lincoln, not to be confused with Elmo Lincoln, the screen's first Tarzan. Another famous name in movie production, Universal, came to Fort Lee in 1914, when Carl Laemmle built the Universal Studio on Main Street. 2 years later, Samuel Goldwyn took it over after breaking away from the famous Players Lasky Company. In 1917, Goldwyn produced his first film, Polly of the Circus, with Mae Marsh, and the name of Goldwyn was on its way to immortality in the film industry. Another 1917 film was Nearly Married, with Madge Kennedy. Marie Dressler made her comedy hit The Scrub Lady at Universal's Fort Lee Studios. And in 1918, one of Goldwyn's minor films was 30 a Week, with Tom Moore and a newcomer named Tallulah Bankhead. Warner Baxter, without mustache, was starred with Mae Marsh in the Goldwyn production All Woman at the Universal. In 1919, Louis Selznick took over Universal and starred Olive Thomas and Elaine Hammerstein, and introduced a promising bit player, Norma Shearer. Customarily, stars and crew celebrated the end of each picture together. Here, Barbara Lamar and crew uphold tradition in the early 1920s at the Universal. The last major production at the Universal before it became part of Consolidated Laboratory was The Fighting Blade, with Dorothy Mackhale and Richard Barthelmess. The year was 1924, and Fort Lee's days as a film center were just about over. Several factors combined to bring about the end of Fort Lee's heyday as a film center. The coming of World War I apparently triggered the change, depriving the studios of the coal needed to heat their stages during half of the production year. At the same time, producers discovered balmy Southern California. The change did not come all at once, but it was irrevocable and complete in the end. Nevertheless, here the motion picture industry began. For a time, this was Baghdad on the Hudson, the town that was Hollywood before Hollywood was. Fort Lee, New Jersey.